Good evening. Again, as Chairman Glidden said, the purpose of this meeting is informational. You'll be getting a lot of information this evening from Miles Bland, who is the principal with Bland and Associates. And you may recognize that name as the consultant who did the very in-depth downtown Winter Park survey research and prepared the successful National Register nominations for the city for our downtown historic district and our Interlochen Avenue Historic District. As Chairman Glidden said, it's a very in-depth full presentation. The board will perhaps have a few questions for Mr. Bland at the conclusion of the presentation. We'll take public comments. But if you all have any questions, in order to take the time to answer them fully, we'll note down your questions and post all the answers on the city website and have hard copies of those available. And just so you know, this is not a decision-making meeting. No action will be taken this evening. It's a lot of information to take in that the board is going to be considering in their future deliberations. So that's the purpose of this meeting. So let me introduce Miles Bland. He's going to tell you a little bit more about himself. But again, the firm has learned a lot about Winter Park in their research for downtown. And we were so proud to have downtown in Interlochen listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Briefly about myself, I'm a registered professional archaeologist, number 10650. I've been practicing for about 18 years and done 780 projects in 7 states, resulting in about 380 publications. I hold a master's in anthropology with specializations in physical anthropology and archaeology. I hold a graduate degree in museum management. I hold an MBA and I hold a Juris Doctorate. I currently serve as the treasurer for the Florida Archaeological Council. I'm also on the board. I also sit on the Government Affairs Committee, the Membership Committee, and the Bylaws Committee. This is a 5,000 word, 30 slide presentation, so I'll try to keep this moving along. This is a technical analysis prepared for the HPB. I do not speak for the city or the HPB. This is data only. Kicking it off, and you'll have to excuse me, I'm an archaeologist. This is primitive technology. Doesn't work out. Bear with me. Okay? All right. Historic resources include a wide variety of parts of the natural and built environment, both historic and prehistoric. Historic structures are the largest single group of cultural resources. If a house is over 50 years old, it is historic. Not significant, just historic. Historic preservation makes economic sense. The National Main Street Center, a program that uses historic preservation to revitalize town centers and neighborhood commercial districts, has actually tracked economic results in about 1,700 Main Street communities nationally. These preservation-based programs have created over 231,000 new jobs and resulted in over $17 billion in reinvestment to date, with every dollar spent on a historic preservation program yielding about a $40 economic return. This data is a few years old, so these numbers are presumably higher just from the standpoint of inflation. And these numbers are for Florida. Historic preservation laws make legal, local, and economic sense. Historic preservation laws no more infringe upon property rights than do other laws, and even private rules that we have long accepted. Though everyone likes to believe my home is my castle and I can do whatever I want with it, this statement doesn't reflect reality. Zoning laws, street speed limits, structural building codes, fire codes, electoral codes, local ordinances all prevent your neighbor from replacing their single-family home with a metal scrapyard, a landfill, or a skyscraper behind your back fence. Zoning is a compromise between individual wants and community needs and concerns. If you live in a gated community, your property rights are limited even further by covenants and restrictions, documents that can legally prevent you from owning a pet, washing a car in your driveway, or having a basketball hoop over the garage. Covenants and restrictions are far more burdensome than historic preservation laws and are commonly accepted. In an economic sense, the historic area includes both commercial buildings and residences, like Winter Park. A home's value rises because home buyers will pay a premium for homes where they can walk to shops, restaurants, and work. And in Winter Park, The household median income is 57,432, while the Florida's means 47821. That's more than one standard deviation above the norm. So Winter Park is attracting well-to-do and affluent of residents. And they identify with the historic preservation elements in the town. There are about 12 federal laws that guide historic preservation in the United States. The National Historic Preservation Act is the primary law. The intent of Congress, as stated in the National Historic Preservation Act, is that the historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of our community life and development in order to give a sense of orientation to the American people. Further, it is public policy to foster conditions under which our modern society and our prehistoric and historic resources can exist in productive harmony. Preservation and growth are friends, not rivals. To grossly stereotype, growth advocates see preservationists as a bunch of NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And preservationists sometimes see growth advocates as people who want to tear down neighborhoods wholesale and put up giant high-rises. The truth is in between. Historic buildings have value and need protection, and good urban design is much better for our communities and the environment than bad urban design. However, altering mindsets about these notions is difficult, and dialogue and education about the balance between growth and historic preservation is the course of action at this time. So quickly, let us approach a few of the mindsets which pose barriers really to useful dialogue. The first mindset is if a property gets designated as a historic landmark, it's protected forever and can never be demolished. Well, that's not true. While designation ensures a more thorough review of demolition proposals, it doesn't prohibit demolition outright. Even listing in the NRHP, which is more elevated than a mere local listing, does not provide total ironclad protection. Although demolition of a designated landmark generally requires preparation of a report to assess the feasibility of alternatives to demolition and to mitigate the demolition, a property owner may be able to obtain approval to destroy a landmark if it is unsafe, unsalvageable, etc. A well-designed demolition permit system is reasonable. Number two, historic preservation only benefits affluent communities. It's only for the fancy buildings in your neighborhood. That's not true. The purpose of historic preservation is to accurately reflect and celebrate the unique story of community and its people through its built environment. Historic preservation is guided by the American principle of diversity and the full range of the American experience, which is reflected in all of our historic landmarks. The preservation movement, by definition, is diverse. Mindset number three, historic designation will kind of reduce my property values. This is not true. Almost universally opposite is true. Study after study has conclusively demonstrated that historic designation in historic districts actually increase property values. Designations give a neighborhood or an individual historic site a certain cachet that sets it apart from ordinary properties. Buyers seek out the unique qualities and ambience of a historic property. Historic district designation gives potential home buyers two rare and economically valuable assurances. Number one, that the very qualities that attracted them to the neighborhood will actually endure over time. And number two, that they can safely reinvest in sensitive improvements to their home without fear that the neighbor will undermine this investment with inappropriate new development. Number four, my property is designated as historic. I won't be able to change it in any way, and I don't want my property to become like a museum. This is also not true. Owners of designated historic structures can make very significant changes to their structures, especially so to the interiors. Historic preservation laws are not meant to prevent change, but only manage change. This management is almost exclusively focused on the exterior, and provisions are made for such things as handicapped access. The tool to manage change is the Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, which are the nationally accepted benchmark for evaluating changes to historic structures and/or your local ARB guidelines. Such standards don't require that every element of a historic site remain intact. Only the most significant or character-defining historic elements of a property should be retained. New additions to the historic property can be allowed, but should be compatible with the site's historic architecture. Historic preservation is bad for business. Well, historic preservation is really at the heart of our nation's most vibrant economic development and business attraction programs. From Miami to traditional historic southern cities such as Charleston and Savannah, to the recent boom in heritage tourism, today's economic development strategies no longer see preservation and business development as competing values. There's no denying the power of historic preservation. Charleston's been ranked the #1 tourist destination in the world for the last 3 years consecutive running. Retail expert Robert Gibbs writes that while people love big box stores like Walmart, they also seek out authentic and historic places like downtown Winter Park to shop and dine. Preservation is more expensive than new construction. This can be true at times, but in many cases, historic preservation is typically more cost-effective than new construction. Why? Historic buildings certainly do sometimes need upgrades, but these are usually less expensive than the cost of building all new foundations, structural systems, roofs, and building finishes. In one study, the National Trust for Historic Preservation reports that in Chicago, where the public school system is now spending about $2.5 billion to upgrade facilities, bare bones new construction costs are about $155 per square foot, while renovation is only about $130 per square foot. Currently, it's cheaper to build new construction locally due to the recent downturn, but construction costs are rising as the economy recovers. And the greenest building is the one that we've already given the embodied energy of existing materials and construction. If it's already built, it is the greenest thing around. And Winter Park has local architects, contractors, and tradesmen with the expertise in the rehabilitation of historic buildings for contemporary use. The experts are here. If I buy a historic property, there's lots of government money available to help me fix it up. This is not true. Okay? While it doesn't necessarily cost more to renovate a historic structure than to build a new, few large government or foundation grants are available to owners of historic properties. And even those few typically limit eligibility to government agencies or nonprofits. There's no vast pool of government money for historic preservation, but there's also no vast pool of government money for new construction. What is available for historic properties versus new construction tends to be tax incentives for private owners of historic buildings. Owners of sites listed or eligible for listing on the National Register may take advantage of a federal rehabilitation tax credit that provides about a 20% tax offset for the cost of rehabilitation. National Register properties are also eligible to benefit from conservation easements, which are binding legal agreements for preservation that can allow owners to claim a charitable deduction on their federal income taxes. This can be a pretty substantial deduction if it's an income-producing property as well. Old buildings are less safe. Well, that's not really true. Although historic structures do sometimes require structural retrofits or the addition of fire sprinklers to enhance their safety, historic buildings typically perform better than newer construction in earthquakes and other natural disasters, especially hurricanes. Well, what determines the safety of buildings is the quality of construction, not age. And in many ways, they don't build them the way they used to build them. Historic preservation regulations also accommodate all ADA mandated changes, such as handicap access ramps. Preservationists are always fighting new development and only care about the past. While historic preservationists do care deeply about the past, primarily as a way of anchoring themselves in their community as it moves forward toward confidently into the future, historic preservation is not about stopping change, and is certainly not about preventing exciting new architecture and development. Preservation allows us to retain the best of shared heritage, to preserve sites of unique quality and preservation, revitalize neighborhoods, and spur economic revitalization. It's only through moving ahead and past some of these mindsets can we really start to look at the Winter Park codes. So with those sort of things in mind, we're going to take off right into the code. Okay, our first recommendation is to revise, refine, and update the current code in regards to demolition. This is primary because if there's nothing left standing, nothing's really done with it. The current code, specifically Chapter 58 of the LDC, needs to be fully revised. There's a full laundry list of housekeeping amendments needed. For example, the technical definition of historic is not listed on the Florida Master Site File or locally designated, but 50 years old. There needs to be a process under Code Section 584461 for the demolition review of all historic properties 50 years or older, not just locally designated buildings or Florida Master Site File listed buildings. Demolition review form is needed. The form would be required by the Historic Preservation Board before a demolition permit would be issued for any structure over 50 years old. Permit issuance would be guided by the Planning Department of the City of Winter Park, who would conduct a file review and make guidance recommendations to the HPB. In regard to demo permits, an economic hardship provision with specific evidence requirements should be added under Code Section 59479, guidance for issuance. This is needed to prevent hardships and takings claims. Also, in regard to demolition permits, an imminent danger to the public safety provision should be adopted under Code Section 589-479, guidelines for issuance. The provision should require that a structural report prepared by a professional engineer and reviewed by both the planning and engineering departments in the city demonstrate that the building in question is a clear and present danger to public safety, is not restorable, and should address issues of architectural salvage. We also recommend that the Winter Park maintain the use of the certificate of review form for additions and alterations to historic buildings. We also recommend the Winter Park consider a signage mural regulation for downtown if the downtown area ever becomes a local district or a historic district. Currently, the COR goes to a fully administrative system of steps with no elected official involved, only city staff and board. Unless there is an appeal, this division should be maintained. Recommendation number 2 deals with the designation process. As the in-depth analysis conducted by the city has indicated, there are many cities in Florida that require no public voting element in the HB designation. While Sarasota has an NRHB type request to opt out, this is a total factor of the notification process in regard to the number of resources surveyed within a structure area survey district, not owner and volition. In Winter Park, the ordinance requires 20% of the residents of a proposed district sign a petition in favor of district formation. Then a threshold of at least 2/3 of the property owners in the proposed district must submit a ballot in favor of its formation. In Winter Park, this public voting element requiring a 2/3 vote for the historic designation process turns the process into a social affair which pits neighbor against neighbor, and historic boundaries end up defined on the basis of pro and anti-designation factions. The historic districts are in essence defined by modern social structure. In Winter Park, individual historic landmarks also require property owner authorization, with the result that many landmarks are unprotected. Given the essentially voluntary nature of historic designation in Winter Park, the board is then forced into a reactive mode rather than a proactive position. Given a clear mandate from the code about their role, I feel the board would be more willing to be more active. Many cities have no public voting element in historic preservation, and none have a 66% voting requirement. Voting is not the norm. It's quite odd and certainly counterproductive to historic preservation. It is analogous to allowing public determination of residential speed limits, fire codes, zoning, structural codes, or any number of other codes. The voting element of the code is the crux of Winter Park's historic preservation problem. Unless a property has been designated with owner permission or is in a district created with a 2/3 vote, any historic property can, has been, and will continue to be torn down. Data and public hearings should be used to establish historic districts, not public voting. Most people love historic preservation until it is their history they're being told to preserve. Recommendation number 3. HPB qualifications need to be returned to the current version of the code. The professional standards for the HPB were inadvertently removed during the adoption of the citywide board ordinance. These qualifications should be reestablished within the current code and further fully revised. Examples of recommended qualifications include that said applicant be a qualified elector and full-time resident of the city at the time of appointment and during the entire incumbency. There should be an application process. Should possess graduate qualifications from qualified institutions, evidencing expertise in architecture, meaning a licensed architect, history, master's level or PhD, archaeology, registered professional archaeologist, master's level or PhD, law, Juris Doctor, planning, AICP, construction or building rehabilitation, a Florida licensed bonded general contractor, civil or structural engineering, meaning a licensed professional engineer, landscape architecture, meaning licensed RLA, environmental preservation or conservation, meaning a master's level in life sciences, an accountant, meaning a licensed CPA, or a business person, someone with an MBA. As to composition, one member must be a licensed architect. There must be an avoidance of overlapping specialized categories. They can't all be architects. And members from a geographically diverse cross-section would be ideal. All neighborhoods should be represented. Continuing on the HPV qualifications, there needs to be an ironclad conflict of interest provision covering recusal of all HPV members from any review of property they own, and no HPV member or their firm can receive city funds, bid on historic preservation-related contracts in the city for 2 years prior to or subsequent to their 3-year terms of incumbency, which are also term limited, so they only serve 3 years. Actual expenses reimbursable to HPV members should be reported on a FIFO basis, which is first in, first out, accounting with a ledger, which is subject to an annual financial report, which is open to the public. In the event that a vacancy occurs in an HPV seat, and for which there is no application from a qualified resident, the city council should appoint said vacating member. This appointment would only be temporary, and upon appointment of a qualified resident to the vacancy, the temporary appointment shall terminate. You have to have these strict qualifications to apply for a CLG status, and that's where we're going next. Okay. Winter Park needs to become a certified local government as soon as possible, because CLG status will help pay for needed historic preservation. State level historic preservation funding has largely been absent since 2009, and it's unlikely to return. Projects and grants are applied for and awarded, but the projects are never actually funded. Winter Park needs to obtain CLG status as written into the currently existing code. Many of the Central Florida areas are already CLGs, including Daytona Beach, DeLand, Edenville, Kissimmee, Orlando, New Smyrna Beach, Windermere, and a bunch of others. Once you have a CLG status, grant funding is available on a matching basis, typically up to a level of about $25,000, which makes up about $50,000 available per year for historic preservation. It can also be done in smaller denominations. This is substantial money. The city of Fernandina Beach, for example, has taken $50,000 a year in CLG funding every year of the current recession. So there's real money. Okay? Without funding, there's really no historic preservation. Today we have heard discussion that they may actually remove the matching component from the CLG program, meaning the city of Winter Park just has to apply and now doesn't even have to put up money. Okay, that's just today, we don't have the full details on that. But if so, then it's even easier to get CLG funding. You still have to do a grant application, you still have to go and present and stand before the HBC in Tallahassee to get it, but it sounds like it's going to be a little easier. These grants, CLG grants, can be used for a variety of historic preservation projects, including historic structure surveys, the development of guidelines and ordinances, preparation of individual nominations, the preparation of district nominations, and community history projects. However, even if the CLG status is awarded to Winter Park must allocate time and resources, meaning adequate staffing and support, for its local planning department and historic preservation officer to complete the grant applications, or you can sub the grant application process out. Improper or incomplete or unrepresented grant applications will not win you any awards. Rest assured that the other cities are more than happy to seriously compete for these funds with Winter Park. Recommendation number 5, revise, refine, update the technicalities of various sections of the current code. There's some other revisions and points we shall touch on as we move through, but real quickly, there's some old text that needs to be deleted. The inordinate burden text of 58-449 is non-standard for historic preservation codes and somewhat dated. It could be stricken. The HPV and the city attorney have proposed some excellent modifications, which should be largely adopted. I especially like the clarification between a standard and a special certificate of review, which took a little while for me to get when I was reading it. The code's got to be updated regularly. Some boards update their guidelines every 2 to 3 years. Most do every 5 to 10 years. Winter Parks Code was promulgated in 2001, so it's quite old. Recommendation number 6, there's not a whole lot of them, but use whatever state level programs are still funded. The Florida Historical Marker Program makes available highway and street markers to identify events and historic places. These markers are another tool that contribute to historic preservation education programs. Typically, the markers appear in the form of a bronze or maybe a composite sign with a standardized but distinctive shape employed by the Florida Department of State. Likewise, the exact detailed requirements for a resource to be considered can be found online for a Florida Heritage Landmark sign. Those are made for nice local signs. The BHP DHR will match funds with these projects. So they have about 4,000, so if y'all put up 500, they'll match 500 each sign. Winter Park's got a local plaque design program. It needs to be expanded to more than it's currently at about $2,000 to $3,000 a year. So it could be a little more funded. It also needs to be standardized and codified to make it official. Also FDOT projects. Although they take a long time to come to fruition, road improvement projects, specifically downtown streetscaping projects, are another way to back into historic preservation funding. The City of Mount Dora has been highly successful with this program. Recommendation number 7, archaeological ordinance and GIS predictive model. Many cities in Florida, Sarasota, Jacksonville, St. Augustine, Indian Beach, Bernardino Beach, have both an archaeological ordinance and an archaeological predictive model. Archaeological ordinances and GIS predictive models are vital for underground utilities work, which happens every few decades, construction zones next to cemeteries, and all Native American issues. Such code would formalize the city's commitment to identify and protect and recover, when necessary, significant archaeological resources on public and private projects in the city. It would add a new article to the city code dealing with the archaeological resources with standards which are tied to specific predicted probability zones. These specific zones of archaeological probability are classified in a geographical information system overlay as a high, medium, low, and known archaeological site probabilities. Essentially, a project would know what its archaeological risk was when the dot appeared on the map before the project started. Such a code section would also set up procedures for identifying significant archaeological resources citywide. And I think that's important because things like Miami Circle do become tourist attractions. It would also define criteria to determine which sites are significant and focus on protecting significant sites in place and or mitigating development impacts on significant sites. So there's really nothing that's going to say you can't do it. We're just going to offset it. A local code would also provide for local staff approvals of the letter of concurrence if development will not impact any identified significant archaeological sites. This is typically tied to DHR with a memorandum of agreement. And this reduces review time and it really expedites the permitting process when you do it on a local setting. An archaeological code would also set up procedures for the preparation and implementation of a mitigation plan by any applicant when the development might impact a significant archaeological site. This could be a great example of a CLG grant project based on DHR funding cycles. And by that I mean they fund these. Recommendation number 8, update your surveys and your historic structure surveys, and also survey your unexamined areas. For over 35 years, various property owners, organizations, and municipal officials have expressed an interest in documenting, recognizing, and preserving the heritage of Winter Park. Since 1978, various spot surveys have been conducted in the downtown, each of those recording a random sampling of historic architecture in the downtown. In at least 5 previous instances between 1978 and 2005, agencies, organizations, and consultants have surveyed only select pieces and sites in Winter Park's downtown. The next comp plan update is due in 2016, so the city should update as fully as possible before then. There must be more survey on the ground since it is not possible to manage what you do not know is there. There are large voids in the survey coverage areas. Whole neighborhoods are omitted, and areas need to be tied up. Of note, some updating has been done by the city to remove demolished, which are too many properties at this point, and added a few previously overlooked buildings. The databases of what have been previously recorded must be geo-rectified and corrected. This is a very serious problem in Winter Park because the USGS map, which so many people use in the pre-computer era, has the street names actually labeled wrong. So the addresses are incorrect on hundreds of the forms. This is a lot of work, but could be a CLG grant project based upon established DHR funding cycles, meaning this is something they do fund with CLG money. From a techno-functional standpoint, this has to be done first, because if you don't close up the voids and know what's inside your area, you can't really move forward. Recommendation number 9, and I want to clarify this, citywide architectural review design guidelines. These would apply not citywide, but one manual would apply to the guidelines for each historic district. So I'm not saying the whole city, folks, I'm just saying the districts. So you might have specific guidelines for, a certain area, a certain subdivision. But it's not citywide. I want to make sure we're clear on that. While acknowledging the current Winter Park downtown facade regulations, for the most part, the current code just weakly refers to the Secretary of Interior standards. Community support does not appear to have been present in the past, and the city must consider some comprehensive architectural designs which cover the whole city in terms of defined historic districts or zones, okay? Not the whole city, defined districts and zones. The purpose of these guidelines is to define certain standards of architectural design and site development relative to the development, construction, and life cycle modifications and to structures within a defined zone being a historic district, okay? Different zones of the city would have standards appropriate for the uses therein, residential versus commercial, lakefront versus not lakefront, things like that. Adherence to these guidelines will result in orderly, aesthetically pleasing development that preserves and enhances property values for all owners and upholds the values of traditional neighborhood development. The guidelines need to be well illustrated in terms of graphics and thorough in terms of recognized architectural styles. The goal is consistency. To codify and link to these guidelines, at a minimum, the addition of a standardized list of 10 local non-fanciful standards under section 58-469 of the Winter Park Code is recommended. By non-fanciful, I mean no styles such as North Maple Street East vernacular. Okay? It has to be a recognized historic building style. The HPB, in concert with the planning department, would act as an architectural review body. Once again, this would be a great CLG project because they have funded these time and time again. Recommendation number 10, going back to the beginning, we need to add an HB element to the comprehensive plan during the 2016 update. The current comp plan was adopted in 2009 under ordinance 2762-09. While amendments to the future land use and intergovernmental coordination elements were adopted in October 2010, and the capital improvements element was amended in September 2011, there is an HB section in the future land use. When the city does a full plan update in 2016 in compliance with the requirements of Chapter 163, the city should incorporate a new historic preservation element in the comp plan. Recommendation number 11. We need to encourage historic preservation activities in Winter Park. Respectfully leverage local groups such as the Winter Park Chamber of Commerce, the Winter Park Historical Society, the Friends of Casa Felix, and many others, and I apologize in advance to anyone I did not list due to space constraints. Some programs that might be considered would be public education through a historic preservation day, week, month, public speaking events and conferences at the local library. Use state resources like DHR, BHP, DOT, and nonprofit resources like the Florida Trust, although the Florida Trust is currently going through a transition at this time. Possibly historic recognition awards for Home Restoration of the Year, Historic Garden of the Month, publications, fundraising, individual contributions. Public relations materials such as low-frequency AM broadcasts, and by that I mean the very low-power transmitters, which people can drive into a neighborhood, tune to 530, and it says, "Hi, you're proceeding down Maple Street. On the right, you'll see this house. On the left, you'll see this house." They're very affordable, and they're often used by realtors. So that's where you'll find them in use around here. Maps, brochures, websites, and of course, signage. Recognize that these activities, however, are secondary to the kind of serious and fundamental primary historic preservation problems which Winter Park faces. And it's important to acknowledge that this technical HP work cannot be done, all be done by volunteers, no matter how well-intentioned or civic-minded they might be. We occasionally run into that. It's just doesn't happen. Recommendation number 12, need to act now because time's kind of running out for Winter Park. Winter Park is among the most historic cities in Florida. And Winter Park's elected officials, property owners, and merchants are at an important crossroads in the city's preservation history. Only 2 historic districts have been established to date, and relatively few individual registered nominations. Historic structures were sparse to begin with in Winter Park, only about 8% of the total residential and commercial structures combined, and are being lost at a pretty staggering rate. About 1.2% of the net known historic structures are leveled each year, and this rate is accelerating. That rate may be higher because we don't know the total survey area. So if anyone has questions about that, that's a great question. If the historic structure density drops too low, then historic districts can never be formed due to loss of spatial continuity. By that I mean if I have too low a density of historic structures, I can't make it a historic district. There have to be enough houses in the neighborhood, enough commercial residential buildings in the district for me to draw it on a map as an area. And if there's too much destruction in either one of the existing districts, then the keeper can delist you immediately. So that's also a problem. Winter Park needs to fund historic preservation every year and soon. Many cities have a full-time HP department, or at least a staff member, and they're competing successfully for limited HP funds. Although the planning department does a huge amount with a little bit, Winter Park's HP program lags behind its neighboring municipalities. Use it or lose it, folks. Management of the historic resources need to become preservation of historic structures. Historic resources are non-renewable, and once they're gone, they can't be replaced. You're not going to be able to do anything. Tear down all the historic structures, and your tax base, both property and income, will most assuredly follow. This is a grim trend which is in need of reversal. And that's it, folks. Well, thank you for giving me that.